The dust of creation, dawn era. Before the first star, there was silence. Before silence, there was dust. And before even the dust, there was a breath yet unspoken. The Eicora, verse 1. In the beginning, there was nothing. No light, no time, no motion. Only the void, an endless expanse devoid of meaning, deaf to purpose, blind to possibility. And yet, drifting through this eternal stillness were specks, motes, tiny fragments of something more. Dust, as the oldest scribes would come to call it, the dust of creation. These fragments were neither alive nor dead. They were neither past nor future. They were remnants of countless ruined realities, collapsed timelines, forsaken possibilities, and dreams that dared existence but never quite reached it. Some believe they were the bones of old gods long forgotten. Others claim they were seeds waiting to bloom. It was from this sacred nothingness that the first breath stirred. The dust of creation did not coalesce by chance. It resonated, ever so faintly, to a rhythm not yet born. Like iron to a lodestone, the particles began to draw inward. This was not the pull of gravity as known by mortal scholars, but the summoning of will, a yearning from the void itself. And then, from the center of this gathering spiral of potential, he was born. Ashenvau, the primordial worm. His form was not of flesh and bone, but of radiant nebulae and stardust. An infinite serpent of coalescing galaxies. His wings spanned the distances of stars. His breath forged the first heat to ever stir. He did not speak, for there were no ears to hear. He did not think, for there were no minds to ponder. He simply was, a being of pure creative instinct. With his awakening came the dawn of time, the concept of direction, the idea of change. As Ashenvau stirred, the dust danced. Each beat of his wings sent spirals of matter outward. Each twist of his tail birthed suns. He moved not with intent, but with need, the need to become. From the trails of his passing, the laws of physics condensed like dew. Matter and antimatter began their delicate courtship. Gravity spun webs across the darkness. Worlds formed in the wake of his passage, some barren, some teeming, and some still yet to awaken. The void, once mute, now hummed. This event, the first stirring, is considered the moment when reality itself was born. It is the point on which all mortal calendars hinge, even if its true date can never be known. In the Eicora, it is said that Ashenvau's first breath seeded the Ashe itself, the divine lattice through which magic would later flow. Priests of the Eicora teach that every soul, every spark of magic, is a grain of the dust of creation, called forth by Ashenvau's motion. Scholars believe that the shape of reality was forever imprinted by his awakening. The spiral arms of galaxies echo the curl of his tail. The core of planets mirror the pulse of his heart. Temples across Eicora begin their rites by facing outward toward the stars and inhaling in silence, a ritual known as the first breath, in homage to the worm who broke the void. Thus begins the Wyrmheart Chronicles, not with the world nor the gods, but with the dust and the breath that gave it meaning. Ashenvough's roar, dawn era. From silence, breath, from breath, roar, and from that roar, resistance. For all things that move must, in time, be met. The Eicora, verse 2. Having stirred from stillness and woven the seeds of reality into being, Ashenvough did not rest. The breath that began all things became a roar, a declaration that silence had ended and the age of shaping had begun. Where his breath once created harmony, his roar brought structure. The great cosmic worm twisted through the fresh matter of the universe, and with each thunderous call, stars flared into life, gravity bowed, and the walls between realms began to thin. It was not destruction, but orchestration. Galaxies spun in answer to his voice. Planes of existence rippled outward. Light no longer drifted aimlessly, but took shape, guided by his will. It was the roar that etched laws into chaos. The roar was not a singular cry, but an ongoing resonance, a harmonic that pulsed through the young cosmos. Where the first breath summoned being, the roar commanded order. In these eons, the material plane gained its laws of balance and motion. Parallel realms echoed into existence, the ethereal, the elemental chaos, the budding hollow dark. Each was formed as a reflection of his vocal resonance, tuned like strings of a great celestial lyre. Worlds once errant found their rhythm, suns ignited with consistent burn. The universe, though still vast and untamed, had begun to hum in harmony. This era became known in many faiths as the Voice Age, a time when creation was still being spoken into place. But not all echoes faded into light. In the depths where the roar could not reach fully, its distortion began. The earliest whispers of imbalance. The void, cracked and trembling, listened and twisted what it heard. The laws born of Ashenvough's roar are embedded in every corner of existence. Scholars name them the Eight Harmonies, precursors to the domains that the Adrix would later embody. Each law governs aspects such as permanence, change, motion, rest, light, dark, force, and void. While most beings live their lives unaware of these primal chords, all creatures are bound to them. Magic itself obeys the frequencies set during this age. Many ancient rituals require incantation tones in alignment with what is called the Oshonic scale, an echo of the original roar. Temples consecrated to Ashenvough often feature great horns or stone chimes, believed to resonate with his lingering cry. Certain places in the world, high atop mountains, deep within crystalline caves, still carry the resonance, and those who hear it in dreams return changed, marked as prophets or madmen. The roar did not merely create structure, it taught reality to listen. The birth of balance, Dawn Era. The void had known silence for eternity, but on that day, it knew fear. The Eicora, verse 3. In the early eons of ordered creation, Ashenvow's voice carved the rules of existence into the firmament. Yet, even divine resonance casts a shadow. From the furthest edges of the young cosmos, where the roar grew thin and cold, came a stillness that was not silence. It was purpose. It was opposition. There, in the dark between Ashenvow's breaths, something began to stir. It did not emerge. It refused. Where Ashenvow created with motion and will, this being unmade with stasis and consumption. It was not born of dust, but of absence. It did not burn. It hollowed. It became known as Erebos Rex, the Hollow King. Erebos did not come roaring into being like Ashenvow. He formed like a scab on reality, slow, festering, inevitable. In the deepest crevices of the cosmos, where light could not reach and law was yet to be written, his being coagulated into a shape both living and not. He had no defined form. To some, he appeared as a titanic mass of unraveling void stuff, writhing with spectral limbs and dripping entropy. To others, he was a black star, pulsing with anti-light. But whatever he was, his intent was clear. Unmake, undo, unravel. As Ashenvow passed through galaxies, birthing stars in harmony, the Hollow King followed in his wake, devouring what had been shaped. Planets crumbled into Stygian mist, light twisted into scream. Life, where touched, withered and inverted. He was not evil in the way mortals would understand. He was the universe's counterweight, a balance to Ashenvow's flame. The universe, it seemed, could not abide creation without cost. Thus began the Great Balance. The fundamental truth that all creation would inevitably be met with unmaking. For every world born, another would collapse. For every breath of magic cast, a grain of Ashe would diminish. Erebos Rex would become the first of the Hollow Gods, though he was unlike those that followed. He was the source, the primal echo of resistance to form. All others would spring from his dissolution. Many modern scholars question whether Ashenvow created the Hollow King by roaring too loud, too long. Others insist Erebos was always there, waiting for the flame to cast its first shadow. Temples of balance, often considered heretical, teach that Ashenvow and Erebos were not rivals, but twins of intent. One to shape, one to remind that all shapes must eventually fade. The roar had awakened the universe, but with the Hollow King's coming, it would learn to tremble. The Shadow War begins, Dawn Era. Where light goes, shadow follows, and in the echo of every holy song, another voice waits to be heard. The Eicora, verse 4. The universe, newly awakened by flame and law, knew awe, but awe is not protection. And where the roar brought harmony, it also brought attention. From the deepest rift in the hollow dark, Erebos Rex stirred not just to consume, but to conquer. Where Ashen Vow created galaxies, Erebos sought to corrupt them. With a will sharpened by antithesis, the Hollow King drifted behind the breath of creation, unraveling with cold precision that which had only just been born. And yet, his destruction was not wild, it was surgical. Each collapse mirrored a lesson, each extinguished sun a statement. You cannot shape what I cannot hold. The war between Ashen Vow and Erebos was never declared, for it did not need words. It unfolded like a universal law. For each act of divine shaping, there came a countermeasure, a folding in of space, a severing of lifelines, a howl that bent the Ashe itself. Ashen Vow, for all his glory, was not omniscient. He did not yet understand the true nature of the Hollow. Time and again, he would attempt to chase Erebos from his ruins, to restore what had been taken. But the Hollow King was always a breath ahead, retreating into the darkness between dimensions where light dared not follow. In these moments of cosmic pursuit, reality itself began to strain. Worlds began flickering in and out of sync. Fractured dimensions bled across planes. The great worm's path of creation became a desperate act of restoration. Then came the moment Ashen Vow would remember for eternity. He cornered Erebos in a collapsed starfield, and there, amidst the debris of 1,000 failed suns, the two finally clashed. It was not a battle of fire and steel, but of essence, a war of unmaking versus becoming. The struggle shattered systems, birthed new planes, and for the first time, Ashen Vow knew the taste of loss. Erebos had slipped away once again, from within the very clutches of the primordial worm's claw. And as quickly as the battle began, Ashen Vow was now on the hunt again. A titanic conflict, Dawn Era. Where gods tread, the stars go silent. Where titans clash, the sky forgets how to shine. The Eicora, verse 5. The pursuit could not last forever. Though Ashen Vow hunted the Hollow King from ruin to ruin, he could not reclaim what had been lost. Erebos Rex always slipped away, folding into the hollow dark before the primordial worm could strike. And so, Ashen Vow changed the rules. He would no longer chase in vain. No longer would he restore what was already broken. Instead, he would set a trap. A beacon so radiant that the Hollow King could not ignore it. A flame so pure, it would draw even the Void's envy. He would create the most fertile galaxy ever to bloom. The trap began with a single song. A slow, harmonious pulse of the Ashe, expanding across 1,000 systems. Ashenval poured this song into the creation of the living spiral, a sector of space overflowing with creation. Stars born of harmony, worlds dripping with promise, oceans of raw potential. This was not a home for mortals, but a lure for ruin. It was here Ashenval hid, folding his vast form into the heart of a sun, becoming still, waiting for the inevitable. And come it did. Erebos Rex arrived in silence. There was no scream, no herald, only the withering of stars and the dimming of all light within the spiral. He did not strike immediately. He savored the feast before him. But he did not know the worm lay in wait. When Ashenval rose from the sun, the void itself recoiled. The two titans clashed in a storm of divine essence. It was not a duel, it was apocalypse. Stars collapsed like embers. Reality folded in protest. Time bent around their fury. The Ashe rippled in agony. For an unknown time they warred. Not in years or centuries, but in cosmic tremors and generational memory. Witnessing their battle drove entire species to extinction. Some worlds birthed religions around the echoes. Others simply burned. But Ashenval refused, with every fiber of his cosmic being, to let the Hollow King flee again. And at last, Ashenval roared with the force of finality. He coiled his immense body around the Hollow King and ripped him apart, shattering Erebos into 1,000 shards of Stygian matter. The Hollow King was no more. But in his triumph, Ashenval had unknowingly swallowed a splinter of what he destroyed. The destruction of Erebos Rex came at an incalculable cost. Whole sectors of space vanished. Ancient laws of physics were rewritten. The living spiral was left fractured, its song forever dissonant. And worse, the Hollow did not die. The shards of Erebos became seeds, fragmented minds of the same nihilistic will, cast across the universe like dark pollen. From them rose the lesser hollow gods, each a distorted echo of their source. And within Ashenval himself, the sliver of corruption he had unknowingly absorbed would fester. Though victorious, the primordial worm was forever changed. He had destroyed the Hollow King, but he had also invited the Hollow in. Thus ended the War of Titans, but the war for creation had only just begun. Shards of the Hollow, Dawn Era. The serpent struck down the Shadow King, but from his corpse spilled whispers, and the whispers in time learned to speak. The Eicora, verse 6. The defeat of Erebos Rex should have been an ending. The stars that survived burned with the hope of peace. The Ashe, though wounded, settled into new rhythms. But hope is often blind to what it cannot comprehend. The Hollow King was shattered, but not destroyed. Each fragment of his unraveling form retained a memory, a hunger, a seed of the will that once commanded uncreation. These were not random remains. They were intent given shape, and like rot in fruit, they spread where they landed. Scattered across the edges of creation, the shards of Erebos embedded themselves in realms, planes, and places unseen, and in time they began to grow. Unlike Erebos Rex, the hollow gods did not require vast battles or divine spectacle. They emerged in silence, often unseen. Some manifested as corrupted constellations. Others took root in the hearts of unstable worlds, birthing whispers that twisted mortal minds. Each shard became a godling, fragmented but potent, incomplete but focused. They did not seek dominion as their progenitor had. They sought erosion. One such shard would become Zalthun, the Pale Coil, whose essence seeped into a moon's core and turned its seas into memory-draining tides. Another, Myrphage, would fester within the bones of a forgotten god, feeding on worship like carrion. Still others were not known by name, only by consequence. The extinguishing of stars with no record, entire planes collapsing inward in anti-ritual. Worse still, these entities began to call to one another. Drawn by shared purpose, they slithered toward places of thin reality, tearing at the veil. Where two or more shards merged, the result was not additive, it was exponential. The hollow was no longer one mind, it was a chorus of hunger. The shards of the hollow represent the first true cosmic contagion. Unlike Erebos Rex, who was known and feared, the hollow gods thrive in obscurity. Their followers often do not know what they serve. Their voices are mistaken for prophecy, madness, or divine revelation. This era marked the first rise of hollow cults, groups of mortals drawn to power that promised transformation through sacrifice. Some sought to summon their patron shards. Others hoped to merge with them. A few succeeded, but none remained immortal. The Umbral Jails, Ancient Era. A cage without walls, a prison without keys, where screams cannot echo and time forgets to count. The Eicora, verse 7. With the shards of the hollow spreading like an unspoken curse across creation, Oceanvow was forced to reckon with a truth even he could not reshape. The hollow could not be destroyed. It could only be contained. Oceanvow carved open pockets of unreality, voids outside the material and beyond even the hollow dark. These weren't spaces in the conventional sense. They were non-places, exile realms severed from time and unanchored by law. Here, he would cast the fragments of Erebos Rex. Here they would sleep. Thus were born the Umbral Jails. Each Umbral Jail was tailored to the shard it held. Some were labyrinths of silence, others endless stillness, others yet looping pockets of shattered dreams. One was said to contain nothing but a single flickering candle, forever burning, forever alone. Sealing the hollow gods was not a clean process. To anchor each jail, Ashenvow had to embed slivers of the Ashe itself into their walls. This weakened the weave across the universe, but it was the only way to hold the hollow at bay. Over time, as more shards were imprisoned, the jails themselves became sentient ruins, reflections of their prisoners. Mortals who stumbled upon them through blind fate or foul magic found not forbidden temples, but echoes of madness. Once the jails were built, Ashenvow turned his gaze to Eicora, his chosen cradle, and prepared for what would be his greatest and final gift. But the jails were not infallible, and though Ashenvow imprisoned an uncountable number of hollow gods, he could not hunt them to the last. The jails remain hidden in the folds between planes, each a ticking pulse of dread, each a reminder that what was torn apart might one day pull itself back together. The Wyrmheart's creation, Cataclysm era. What cannot be destroyed must be outlasted, and to outlast, one must plant a flame that never dies. The Eicora verse 8. With the hollow gods imprisoned but not ended, and his own essence now strained from countless acts of creation, Ashenvow faced the truth of his waning. The universe was set in motion. The Ashe had been woven, but the hollow gods would return. So the great worm conceived a final answer, a last breath that would echo through all time. From the light of 1,000 dying suns, Ashenvow summoned the raw essence of permanence. With his heart as the forge and his will as the mold, he shaped the Wyrmheart egg, a vessel of creation so potent that within it grew a being yet unborn, one day destined to surpass even its sire. This egg would not merely house life. It would become hope itself, the very memory of Ashenvow. The Wyrmheart egg was unlike anything that the universe had seen before. It shimmered with threads of all 8 aspectal domains: fire, earth, water, air, life, death, spirit, and frost. Within it slept not a child, but a potential, a being of unmeasured power, forged to awaken only if the Hollow King ever rose again in full. But such a vessel would require shelter. Ashenvow searched the void for a world worthy to cradle the egg. In a distant spiral of stars, nestled in a quiet corner of the cosmos, he found it. A fledgling planet where myriad humanoid races had already and quickly developed sentience. A place untouched by the hollow. A canvas not yet stained. He named it Eicora, though in his own tongue it was the Primaleth Eicora, the guardian cradle. With one final, earth-rending act, Ashenvow descended upon the young world and drove the Wyrmheart egg deep into its core. The planet cracked, screamed, and began to reshape around it. Mountains rose like scales, oceans poured from the fractures. The Ashe, drawn by the egg's pulse, began to root itself into the planet's bones. Eicora was no longer just a world, it was a womb, The embedding of the Wyrmheart egg into Eicora is known in mortal history as the Primalix event, a moment of cataclysm and genesis intertwined. It accelerated evolution, reshaped the planet's crust, and seeded the conditions for all future mortal life to come. To protect this sacred core, Vow split the last fragments of his divine essence and created the Adrix, 8 great draconic guardians, each tied to one of the fundamental threads of reality. These beings would watch over the world, guide its people, and defend the egg until the day it must awaken. His final act complete, Vow let his form dissolve into the Ashe. He did not die, for beings like him cannot. But he no longer was. Only memory, only breath, carried on the threads of what he left behind. The hollow still dreams, but so too does the worm. And one day, the heart he left behind will wake. The settling of the dust, Cataclysm era. He chose not the brightest world, nor the strongest. He chose the one that listened. The Eicora, verse 9. When Vow embedded the Wyrmheart egg deep within the mantle of Eicora, the act did not merely alter the world, it defined it. The planet answered his divine will with tectonic resonance. Land masses shifted, crust hardened, flame gave way to foundation. Thus began the true formation of the Primalith Eicora, the world that would cradle hope. In the wake of the Primalix event, Eicora suffered centuries of upheaval. The Wyrmheart's pulse disrupted weather patterns, spawned storms that scoured continents, and cast magma into the sky like omens. But beneath the chaos was purpose. Valleys became ley channels. Mountain ranges settled like ribs around the planetary heart. It was not creation, it was refinement. Eicora would not be the largest world, nor the most prosperous, but it was attuned, a vessel capable of holding the seed of renewal. The shaping of Eicora forged the land's earliest identity. Many ancient cultures would later interpret the seismic aftershocks and strange weather as divine trials. Others built their myths around the egg itself, naming the center lake on Osh the Navel of Flame. Geological records in the modern age still show anomalies from this era. Inexplicable vein-like crystal formations, fault lines in perfect circles, regions where time behaves strangely. The world did not merely accept the egg, it grew around it. The birth of the Adrix, Cataclysm era through Genesis era. From his flame they formed, 8 lights to guard the cradle of fire, and each bore a piece of his roar. The Eicora, verse 10. Though Vow had dissolved into the Ashe, his legacy did not fade. From the embers of his final act, the cosmos drew forth guardians, beings of draconic divinity, shaped not in womb nor forge, but in essence. These were the Adrix, and they would be the stewards of the Wyrmheart egg. Born of different threads of reality, each Adrix embodied a core domain of existence: fire, earth, wind, water, frost, spirit, life, and death. They were not mere elementals, but cosmic harmonics, each tethered to the divine pulse of the Ashe and the growing vitality of Eicora. The Adrix did not all arrive in thunder or spectacle. They emerged like songs taking shape in the world's resonance. The Eicora reads, "From the breath of the first flame did the eight rise, called forth by the dying will of Ashenvow, to shape the firmament and guide the unborn world. Kalos rose from stone, the root-bound shield, whose strength lies in patience. Balgratoric from flame, the forge-born roar, whose fury kindles both war and warmth. Oryx Thune from tide, the endless mirror, whose depths cradle change and cleansing. Iafoa from breath, the sky shaper, whose voice stirs dream and storm alike. Enrasil from bloom, the verdant grace, who wakes the green heart of all things. Freylith from spirit, the wayfarer's flame, who walks between echoes and song. Hycilios from frost, the solemn hush, whose stillness held sorrow and secret alike. And Galgaloth from shadow, the final gate, whose silence marks the end and the truth. Together they were the worm's will, the eightfold flame, and the first covenant sworn. Their presence stabilized the veins of the Wyrmheart, which pulsed erratically after the egg's descent. They drew lines of balance across the globe, shaping ecosystems, guiding weather, and watching over burgeoning life. Yet even as they aided creation, they never claimed dominion. They acted as caretakers, not kings, observers, not rulers. Where they passed, life flourished. Where they lingered, legends formed. From the earliest cave carvings to the oldest standing monoliths, the Adrix appear. Not as deities to be worshipped, but as forces to be understood. Ancient civilizations viewed them with awe, reverence, and caution. Each Adrix left behind marks, relics of their domain, sometimes hidden, sometimes gifted. These would become the foundations of arcane traditions, natural philosophies, and eventually the myths that would fuel entire faiths. The veins of the Wyrmheart, Genesis era. His final breath did not vanish. It buried itself deep in the world, waiting, whispering, winding through stone and soul alike. Eicora, verse 11. As the Adrix moved across the surface of Eicora, a strange pattern began to emerge beneath their feet. Deep below the crust, hidden from the eyes of early mortals, a lattice of radiant force webbed outward from the Wyrmheart egg. These conduits of raw, living power became known as the veins of the Wyrmheart. Invisible to most, and incomprehensible to many, they were not physical tunnels, but spiritual arteries, threads of pure Ashe bound directly to the egg. Where the veins converged, wild phenomena bloomed. Plants grew in unnatural symmetry. Stones hummed with musical frequencies. Beasts born near these sites displayed strange intelligence or monstrous deformity. The Adrix knew of these veins. They whispered to them. They shaped early geography around them, building sanctums, groves, and natural fortresses along their flows. Some say the veins allowed them to travel instantly between great distances. Others believe they served as the Adrix's means of communion with the egg. Mortals who stumbled upon them, often mystics or madmen, were changed. Some gained brief glimpses of a time before time. Others were burned from within, consumed by knowledge their minds could not contain. In later ages, arcanists and seers would name the veins the Wyrmheart, believing them to be the underlying structure from which all magic is drawn. They became the backbone of the arcane sciences, the sacred paths of druidic circles, and the obsession of hollow cults, seeking a way to burrow back toward their imprisoned gods. Even now, cities rise where veins cross. Wars are fought over them, and deep beneath the earth, they continue to pulse in time with the egg, as if waiting for something. For the Wyrmheart does not sleep, it dreams. The firstborn races, Genesis era. Before man walked, an elf dreamed. There were the clawed, the feathered, and the fanged. The Eicora, verse 12. From the churned blood of storms and stone, the earliest sentient life on Eicora would be reshaped by the Primalix event, not shaped by divine hands, but by proximity to the Wyrmheart's resonance. These were the firstborn, a myriad of bestial, avian, reptilian, and primate beings, each changed by the environments that formed in the wake of the egg's descent. Among the earliest to begin to evolve were the Sauri, reptilian giants with cunning minds and tribal hierarchies, who built monoliths of obsidian to track the stars. Along the coastlines and the wind-swept ridges, the Plumerians, avian thinkers who constructed floating nests across cliffs and mountaintops, their bones light, their language melodic. In the marshlands and swamps, the salamandrine flourished, amphibious humanoids who were shamanistic and devout to nature and the natural order. In the deep forest, the prosimians evolved, ape-like, thinkers cautious and clever, who first shaped tools from stone and bark. And beneath the surface, in caverns kissed by frost and flame, crawled the mycelians, fungal entities whose minds worked more in networked intuition than speech. Each of these ancient peoples bore early signs of the day the Primalix event changed the course of their DNA. Runic growths in their skin, song lines etched into their dreams, and ancestral memories tied directly to the veins of the Wyrmheart. Though most of the firstborn faded or evolved into later mortal lineages, fragments of their knowledge, culture, and power persisted. Ruins of their civilizations dot the deep places of the world, often buried or claimed by nature. Though rarely worshipped, the firstborn are still remembered in the myths of druids, shamans, and deep forest tribes. Reading from the chiseled stone or ashen paper, still intact from the inception of recorded history many millennia ago. Their story is not of triumph or tragedy, it is of origin, and the speed of which evolution took pace after the Primalix event. The slow rot, Genesis era through the Anti-Rex era. Corruption does not strike, it seeps, and in silence it waits. The Eicora, verse 13. As the firstborn flourished, a quiet entropy began to ripple through the foundation of Eicora. It did not blaze or scream, it whispered, subtle as a crack in glass. For hidden within the Wyrmheart egg, a single fragment of the Hollow King still pulsed. This fragment, a remnant of Erebos Rex, consumed during his final battle with Ashenvow, lay dormant yet active. A rot not of body, but of meaning, slowly crept through the veins. At first, the signs were indistinct. Sudden floods in places once calm, herds of animals migrating into unnatural climates, shamans and dreamwalkers experiencing distorted visions, encounters with entities not of this world, with minds like black static. Those who lived closest to vein convergences began to feel it first, a dread that could not be explained. It seeped into the roots of old trees, the cores of sacred stones, and the thoughts of the sensitive. Soon, some of the firstborn began to change. Their markings, once reflections of Adric's influence, began to twist. Glowing runes turned black. Language became guttural, alien. These beings touched by the Hollow did not lose intelligence, they lost connection. Their dreams darkened, their unity shattered. The corruption had begun. The slow rot marks the first known instance of Hollow influence returning to the material world after the defeat of the Hollow King. Though unknown to most, this period set the stage for all future conflicts against the dark. Some of the twisted firstborn would become the earliest fiends, prototypes of demons and devils, forged not from malice, but from despair and severance. From this point onward, the Wyrmheart no longer pulsed alone. Something answered it. The fall into flame. Anti-Rex era. They were not born monsters. They were promised power and made the trade. The Eicora, verse 14. Where the slow rot crept, a fire would follow. For as the Hollow's corruption deepened, it offered something the mortal heart could not ignore. Power. The first beings touched by this gift were not ignorant, they were desperate. Tired of being forgotten. Tired of the silence of the Adrix. Tired of being weak. And so they reached back, and in doing so, fell into flame. Those firstborn twisted by the rot began to mutate, not just physically but spiritually. Their forms stretched, their minds unraveled, and their ambitions ignited. They tapped into the veins not as guidance but as weapons. They no longer saw themselves as mortals. They became fiends. Many of these creatures, now demons and devils, sought dominion, not balance. They built cults, sacrificed knowledge for raw sorcery, and made war against the untainted. They were not unified. They did not need to be. Their chaos was enough. The Adrix, still recovering from centuries of shaping and stabilizing the world, could not act directly. Instead, they called upon those mortals still loyal to the harmony of the Ashe, rallying them into the first defensive alliances. But the fall had already begun. The fiends created during this time were not mere monsters. They were ancestors of hatred, beings who remembered what it was like to be mortal, and used that knowledge to manipulate, torment, and conquer. This era became the prelude to a much greater conflict, the Demon Wars. From this moment on, the Wyrmheart was contested ground, not just sacred, but strategic, and its defenders were no longer alone in hearing voices from the deep. The Demon Wars, Anti-Rex era. The stars wept fire, the earth drank blood, and the heavens watched in silence. The Eicora, verse 15. The age of rot gave way to an age of war. No longer content with isolation, the fiends surged across Eicora, seeking to claim the veins and sever the harmony of the world forever. What began as scattered uprisings became a tide of annihilation. The world had never seen such coordinated destruction, nor had it ever been so unified in its defense. This was not a war of nations, it was a war of existence. The Demon Wars raged for centuries. Entire regions were swallowed by flame. Cities became battlegrounds and sacred sites. Once places of healing and peace became fortresses. The fiends weaponized corrupted veins, turning their power into portals, plagues, and weapons of apocalyptic scope. The Adrix, weakened from the shaping of Eicora, cautious not to destroy the veins they protected, could not fight alone. They summoned champions, mortals who resisted the call of corruption and bore the spirit of their domains. These early alliances became the precursors to the Flamebound. Warriors, spellbinders, elementals, and dragons themselves rallied in a final, desperate stand against annihilation. Battles raged across the continents, from the sky-cleft mountains to the coral abyss, and at the center of it all, near the Navel of Flame, the largest siege in Eicora's history unfolded. Though mortals eventually won the war with the guidance of the Adrix, the scars of that conflict remain. Entire biomes were twisted beyond recognition. Languages were lost, cultures destroyed. But something else was forged in that fire. A global memory. A mythic collective wound that shaped all future civilizations. This war also prompted the most desperate act of divine intervention to date, one that would lead to the creation of a prison deeper than the world itself. A new domain would be born. The Hells were to be forged. The creation of the Hells, Anti-Rex era. They could not be destroyed, so we built a place they could never leave. The Eicora, verse 16. Victory in the Demon Wars did not come through annihilation. The fiends, spawned by corruption and sustained by entropy, could not be slain in the way mortals understood death. They would always return, reshaped by hate, reborn through resonance. And so, a solution was forged, not through steel or spell, but containment. The Adrix, in alliance with the most powerful flame-bound and arcane minds of the age, wove together the Hells, a place of imprisonment, designed to hold the fiends beyond time, beyond realm, beyond hope. Using raw veins of Ashe, anchored at convergent points across Eicora, the Adrix and their mortal allies carved a dimensional fold, a sealed realm beneath the world's reality. This plane, ringed by elemental barricades and layered with metaphysical laws, would trap any being touched by the Hollow's influence. Each of the 8 Adrix infused a portion of their essence into its making. It is said that every hell reflects the domain of its warden. Frozen wastelands for those shaped by Hycilios' fall, burning fortresses for the disciples of Balg Rhetoric, endless hunger for those corrupted by Inrasil's shattered bounty. Fiends were bound into this place one by one, sealed by name, by nature, by truth. The process was brutal. Many mortals perished. Others were changed by the proximity to such condensed corruption. But the gates closed, and the world exhaled. The creation of the Hells gave mortals a mythic reassurance. Evil could be buried. But this belief was flawed, because the Hells were not destruction, they were delay. Though sealed, cracks would one day form. Cults would seek to undo the bindings, and worst of all, some mortals would find themselves aligned not against the Hells, but within them. Still, for a time, peace returned. A shattered world would mend. The veins pulsed clean once more, but the whisper remained. Nothing imprisoned stays silent forever. Second breath of life. Anti-Rex era. From war's ash, new souls rose, shaped not by claw, but by choice. The Eicora, verse 17. When the fires of the demon wars faded, and the echoes of the Hells were sealed beneath the world, Eicora did not return to what it had been. It became something new. From the stillness, life stirred again, but not the firstborn. Something different, something adaptable. This was not evolution through instinct, but resilience. The surviving fragments of old bloodlines shaped by war, by veins, and by the memory of gods and fiends alike, gave rise to the modern races. Elves emerged from the forests, once tended by spirit-bound Vakandi, guardians of memory and lore. Dwarves took root in the mountains carved by flame and stone, inheritors of the forge in deep places. Humans spread quickly, born of scattered stock, but driven by unmatched adaptability and ambition. Gnomes and halflings bloomed in harmony with the land, clever and joyful in the silence of peacetime. Orcs, some descended from the war-born fiend slayers, others from hollow corrupted stock, wrestled with dual heritages. Goblins, hobgoblins, trolls, and ogres continued in tribal legacy, evolving into cultures both fierce and self-made. Each of these races, and more, bore subtle echoes of the age before, birthmarks that glowed near veins, dreams of dragons long faded, or songs remembered by heart but not taught. This rebirth marked a turning point in mortal history. The world was no longer just sacred, it was shared. Every people would write their own history. Every kingdom, creed, and cult would spring from these new beginnings. And though the scars of the war still marred the land, it now served as roots for civilization to grow. The rise and fall of kingdoms, Anti-Rex era. Greatness is not what you build, it is what remains when it all collapses. The Eicora, verse 18. With the rebirth of civilization came its oldest companion, ambition. The modern races, newly risen from ash and myth, began to build. Kingdoms, empires, enclaves, and strongholds. Faiths grew into churches. Cities rose upon veins. Roads stitched together the wounds of war, and in time, rivalries returned. But unlike the age before, these conflicts were not spurred by the hollow, at least not overtly. These were wars of pride, of resource, of fear. Civilizations bloomed, fell, and were forgotten in the span of centuries. Eicora had entered its mortal age. The first great kingdoms, like Terrathor, Galdarun, and Dir Velnos, rose from the sacred sites of the wars. Their monarchs claimed divine lineage from the Flamebound, or direct blessing from the Adrix themselves. Some built libraries over old battlegrounds. Others turned vain sites into vaults, mines, or weapons. Magic became a resource, history a tool, faith a weapon. Guilds formed, some to protect knowledge, others to exploit it. Trade routes emerged, guarded by militias and patrolled by dragons still loyal to ancient oaths. But with each passing generation, the memory of the demon wars grew more distant. The hells faded into legend, and vigilance dulled. Some kingdoms were just, others tyrannical. All were impermanent. This era set the stage for the Eicora known today, a world of countless flags, fractured loyalties, and hidden truths. The Adrix remained silent, the veins pulsed on, indifferent to crown or creed. But somewhere in the depths of the world, the Wyrmheart listened, and the hollow had not yet finished whispering. And the shadows prepared to return, to describe the cyclical nature of empire building and collapse leading to the current age. The rise of Vecla, Anti-Rex era. Pride does not begin with triumph. It begins with the belief that triumph is deserved. The Eicora, verse 19. It began not with fire nor with blood, but with thought, a whisper in the minds of mortals, a hunger not born of darkness, but of reflection. In the centuries following the sealing of the hells, as kingdoms rose and fell, and a new residence began to stir, one not tethered to any of the eight. It was born of want, of envy, of entitlement, and found its shape in the minds of man. From this fertile soil, a new Adrix emerged, Vecla, the coiled thought, the serpent of self, the Adrix of pride. Unlike her kin, she was not born from Ashenvau's will. She was not called. She was created. As humanity expanded across Eicora, they began to write new stories. Many revered the Adrix. Others sought power not through reverence, but through imitation. They built statues of themselves, forged legacies in their own image, and spoke words as if they were law. Over generations, these acts of hubris collected in the Ashe, tainting it not with malice, but with distortion. Enough collective thought, enough belief, and something stirred. A spark took root. Vecla did not descend, she arose, from mortal expectation, and empowered by their unspoken creed, we are owed. Though the other Adrix sensed the anomaly, they could not fully perceive her. She moved like shadow between domains, neither sanctioned nor sealed. And where she walked, unity frayed. Vecla's rise did not mark a declaration of war, but of doubt. Her influence encouraged mortals to question the Adrix, their ancestors, their limits. Ambition turned inward. Heroes became kings, kings became tyrants. And while Eicora continued to spin, its veins began to tremble beneath her coiling presence. The Adrix had faced the hollow threat in mortal fiends before, but never had they faced one of their own, born from mortal sin. The Second Great War was no longer a matter of if, but when. The corruption of man, Anti-Rex era. It was not darkness that made them fall, it was the mirror. The Eicora, verse 20. The rise of Vecla was not an invasion, it was an infection. Her power spread not through conquest, but through the hearts of those already predisposed to pride, and none were more susceptible than humanity. Among the mortal races, none were so rapidly evolving, so insatiably curious, so endlessly ambitious. With the Adrix diminished, mankind filled the silence with their own voices, and some were all too eager to listen only to themselves. In courts and council halls, in arcane towers and merchant guilds, the influence of pride slithered unseen. Not all who felt it fell, but those who did so willingly. What began as ambition slowly warped into entitlement. Prideful kings declared divine right. Scholars rewrote history to favor their bloodlines. Heroes erected statues of themselves before their quests were done, and among them, Vecla whispered. Her touch was subtle. She did not demand obedience. She affirmed belief. That they were better, that they were owed more, that no god or man had the right to command them. Over time, cults began to form, not of sacrifice, but of superiority. Nobles anointed themselves chosen of Vecla. Warbands marched under banners proclaiming the sovereignty of mortal will. Even magic twisted, as pride-aligned mages bent the Ashe to serve only themselves. Unaware, they were distorting the very weave that held reality intact. The corruption of man did not end in bloodshed, not yet. It ended in division. Nations that once stood united by the memory of war began to fracture. Temples were abandoned, Adric relics defaced. The Adrix grew distant, unsure how to contend with a threat so thoroughly mortal, and yet so utterly alien. The Ashe itself began to ripple in protest, and in its tension, the veins of the Wyrmheart twitched. Something was coming. and pride would ensure it arrived unopposed. The cults of the Hollow, Anti-Rex era. The serpent opened the gate, but it was the mad who dare stepped through. The Eicora, verse 21. While Vecla stirred pride across Eicora, another echo responded to her presence. Beneath the surface of mortal ambition, the hollow gods had not forgotten their prison. Their influence, long sealed in the umbral jails, had begun to seep through cracks made by mortal arrogance, and the mad were listening. In scattered pockets of civilization, groups of scholars, seers, and broken souls began to have visions. Visions of black suns, inverted mountains, and the face of a being older than all things. They spoke not of salvation, but of release, and so began the cults of the Hollow. The first of these cults called themselves the Ebon Crown. Once noble bloodlines lost to history, the Ebon Crown are zealots cloaked in ceremonial black, believing Erebos Rex was the rightful ruler of all creation, dethroned only by deception. They seek to restore him to his ebon throne, not through brute force, but through influence, corruption, and prophecy fulfilled. Known to manipulate courts, councils, and bloodlines, they wear ceremonial iron circlets and preach that order is born in shadow. Other cults followed. The Black Cradle, who were obsessed with the Wyrmheart egg, believing it to be inherently flawed and destined for rebirth as a hollow entity. They mimic midwifery and birth rituals, twisting them into dark sacraments of decay and transformation. Black Cradle agents often pose as healers, midwives, or caretakers before performing gruesome rites intended to hatch corrupted life. Their symbol, a cracked egg in skeletal hands, is feared across isolated villages. The Stygian Six. Shrouded in mystery and myth, the Stygian Six are 6 chosen warlocks or prophets, each believed to carry a shard of Erebos Rex's will embedded in their soul. They never gather openly, but their convergence is foretold to unmake the veil and serve as a vessel for the Hollow King's return. Each is marked by a curse relic tied to their fragment of divine darkness. Their influence is subtle and long-reaching, warping events from the shadows. All of them had one goal: to open a path to the Hollow Dark and bring one of the old Hollow gods into the world. These cults did more than worship. They acted. They sabotaged temples, infiltrated political orders, and in rare cases, succeeded in summoning avatars, tiny shards of hollow entities temporarily made flesh. One such cult, aided by the whispers of Vecla herself, would eventually succeed in opening a rift between Eicora and the Hollow Dark, briefly allowing a single hollow god to gaze upon and enter into the world of Eicora. The Adrix responded swiftly, but the damage had already been done. For when you stare into the hollow long enough, it does not simply stare back, it remembers you. The Jail Beyond the Moon, Anti-Rex era. We cast them far, but not far enough. The sky is a prison with thin walls. The Eicora, verse 22. When a hollow god breached the veil, Brief though it was, the Adrix could no longer stand idle. The cults had succeeded in doing what nothing had done before. They made a hole in reality wide enough for the dark to stare through. In response, the Adrix gathered in solemn council, for the first time since the Demon Wars. What they forged that day was not a weapon, but a warning. A new umbral jail, one not hidden deep within the world, but placed where all could see and none could reach. They built it beyond the moon. This umbral jail, known among scholars as the Hollow Bastion, was anchored just outside the lunar shadow of Eicora's moon. It was forged through the combined efforts of all 8 Adrix, even as Vekla whispered her opposition, using mirrored veins that circled through sky and void. Within the jail, the recently breached Hollow God would need to be sealed, not slain, for such a thing could not be done. His essence became locked in a stasis of paradox, a place that both existed and did not, where time folded upon itself. The construction caused massive magical disruption across the planet. Tide shifted, stars shimmered wrong, prophets screamed, and the veins themselves buckled, however briefly, as the Ashe groaned under the strain. The Hollow Bastion remains a point of cosmic tension. Most mortals know nothing of it, but some arcane orders and celestial watchers record its occasional glimmers, strange eclipses, bursts of silence, or rain that falls upwards. To the Adrix, it became a grim reminder. If one hollow god could be drawn back by mortal will, more would follow. And for Vekla, it was a challenge. She had always believed Eicora belonged to the strong, and now the sky itself had been changed. She would make sure the next god did not come as a fugitive, but as judge. Frost breaks. Anti-Rex era. Ice does not crack from without, it fractures from within. The Eicora, verse 23. While the other Adrix gathered to fortify the world against the Hollow's resurgence, one remained curiously distant, Hycilios, Lord of Frost. Once a silent sentinel of stillness and preservation, his voice had grown colder, more withdrawn. The rot that touched the Wyrmheart had not spared him. In pride, he knew where to whisper, while the hidden hollow god's corruption sought to ride those whispers into the Adrix essence. Vekla, whose presence coiled through mortal minds, reached out to her brother, not with promises, but with validation. She spoke of betrayal, of being overlooked, of the world forgetting those who preserved while others created. Hycilios listened. The hollow took root, and the frost began to crack. Signs of his faltering were subtle at first. Unnatural winters in equatorial zones, glacial shifts that defied tectonics, auroras that echoed the shapes of screaming mouths. His vein sights grew unstable. His domains once serene turned perilous. In hidden sanctums across the frost-bound north, worshippers of Hycilios began to fracture, some defending their Adrix's silence, others receiving visions filled with swirling darkness and voices not his own. Eventually, it became undeniable. Hycilios was no longer whole. He had been corrupted. Hycilios' fall shattered the Adrix Eight. For the first time, one of Ashenvau's sacred guardians had turned not to protect, but to oppose. His domain remained intact, but it pulsed with hollow echoes. Mortals who drew magic from frost began to feel it twist. Frost mages burned with unseen fire. Summoned storms whispered names they should not know. Vecla and the Hollow God had found an ally, not in allegiance, but in affliction. And in the far north, where cold never fades, the ice began to stir, not with weather, but with war. The Dragonfall War begins. Anti-Rex era through Ascendance era. Gods are not born, they are chosen, and burned until only divinity remains. The Eicora, verse 24. The fall of Hycilios, the emergence of a hollow god on Eicora, and the ascension of Vecla shattered the balance of the Adrix Eight. The peace forged in flame and frost had fractured, and war was no longer a distant threat. It was inevitable. The Adrix turned once again to the mortals, but this time they would not merely guide, they would elevate. Each of the remaining Adrix sought 3 mortals, champions who embodied their domains, who could wield their essence without succumbing to it. These mortals, chosen across continents and cultures, would be transformed into avatars, flame-bound deities forged for war, empowered by the very life essence of each of the Adrix. And the corrupted Vecla and Hycilios did the same. The ascensions were marked by signs across the world, storms that rang like bells, mountains that split and bled light, dreams shared across entire bloodlines. Chosen mortals disappeared for days, only to return transfigured, cloaked in elemental power and ancient purpose. These beings, these new gods, became the first of the new pantheon. They did not inherit their roles. They were refined by trial. In their veins ran the raw essence of creation, and with it came the burden of defending Eicora from the corruption within. The Dragonfall War had begun. This was no war of kingdoms. It was a war between epochs. Each god champion led armies, shaped terrain with a thought, and tore holes in reality simply by clashing with one another. Mortals were both foot soldiers and witnesses, caught in the wake of a conflict that would redraw the world. The Adrix knew they could not survive another war like this, so they made a final pact. Win or lose, they would give all they had, and what remained would be left to the gods they birthed. The 1,000-Year War, Ascendance era. When gods fall, mountains weep. When mortals rise, the world must choose a shape. The Eicora, verse 25. The Dragonfall War did not last a season, nor a generation. It lasted a millennium, 1,000 years of divine conflict, eldritch upheaval, and mortal strife. It was a war fought in every corner of Eicora, across skies torn asunder, plains of ever-burning ash, oceans that boiled from sorrow. It was a war of gods, and gods do not wage war gently. The war began with divine duels, clashes between god champions so potent they reshaped continents. Rivers reversed their course, forests walked, time unraveled in fractured battlefields where moments replayed endlessly or collapsed altogether. Entire civilizations rose in the shadow of a god, only to vanish when that god fell. Some mortals thrived as demi-empires, ruled by their ascended kin. Others devolved into cults or nomads, praying only to survive the next divine tremor. Adric's relics were shattered, some veins dimmed, others bled. Adrix, god, and mortal fought side by side against corruption and Stygian nightmare alike. The first of their major victories would come near the halfway point of the war, when the hollow god that had crept its way onto Eicora was finally sealed within the umbral jail, the hollow bastion, beyond Eicora's moon. But all the while, Vecla and Hycilios rallied their own twisted avatars, warped mirrors of the new pantheon, their powers honed through cruelty and chaos. These anti-gods wielded fear as faith and commanded armies of hollow-marked and traitorous mortals. Only one of the mortals turned deity by the corrupted Adrix would break free from the corruption and join the mortal cause, the goddess Brea, and she would be the last bastion of the once noble Hycilios' domain. The 1,000-year war left scars that never fully healed. Great scars across the earth still smolder with magical residue. The worm weft remains frayed in several regions, impossible to safely channel. By the war's end, the gods had changed, and so had Eicora. The shattered shell, Ascendance Era. The flame endures, but its vessel cracks, and within that fracture, even gods can bleed. The Eicora, verse 26. As the Dragonfall War reached its crescendo, the battlefield expanded into realms long held sacred. Deep beneath Osh, the Crater Lake continent housing the Wyrmheart egg, a terrible realization dawned. In his madness, Hycilios had not only turned against the Adrix, he had defiled their most sacred charge. He had broken the egg. In the final century of the war, amidst the crumbling glaciers of the far north, the corrupted Adrix enacted a ritual powered by hollow influence. Using his frost-warped veins and a storm that blotted out the stars, Hycilios struck at the heart of Eicora from afar. The blow was not total destruction, but a fracture. A single shard broke away from the Wyrmheart egg. The veins shuddered. Magic spasmed across the world. Those attuned to the Ashe fell unconscious, seized by visions of silence and an unborn scream. In secrecy, this shard was hidden, not destroyed. Hycilios, with Vecla's guidance, secreted it away into the hollow bastion beyond the moon, cloaked by divine misdirection. This was not an act of war. It was of preparation. Though the egg remained largely intact, its fracture changed everything. The veins lost rhythm, elemental balance faltered. Even the gods felt their link to the Ashe tremble. The shard's exile planted a future crisis in the sky. A part of Ashenvow now existed outside of Eicora's protection. Its presence dimmed yet still alive. The Adrix, though victorious in battle, knew the war was far from over. The wound in the world would never close. The final reckoning. Ascendance era through Shadow's era. She who rose uncalled fell unheard. He who froze the flame now sleeps beneath it. The Eicora, verse 27. The war did not end with triumph. It ended with sacrifice. When the final clash between the gods tore open the sky and burned through the veins, the world held its breath. The flame-bound, those forged in the crucible of Adric's essence, had learned not just to wield power, but to transcend it. And in one final act, they cast down the corrupted. Vecla was destroyed. Hycilios was buried. In the northernmost caldera of Eicora, where the land itself weeps frost, the final battle reached its conclusion. Vecla, empowered by every false crown and whispered prayer, unveiled her true form, a serpent of gold and black flame, speaking every mortal tongue in unison. But the united gods, those birthed from sacrifice, stood firm. Their blows rang through the Ashe, harmonizing it once more. Vecla was unmade not by rage, but by refusal. No longer would mortals feed her reflection. She collapsed into ash, her essence scattered into silence. Hycilios, broken in both mind and soul, fled to the depths beneath Eicora. There, the surviving Adrix, unwilling to slay their long-loved brother, entombed him in a prison of glacial crystal, unmelting, unmoving, unknowable. With the war ended, the corrupted vanquished, and the corrupted gods of the fallen Adrix retreated and in hiding, the Adrix fulfilled their final vow. Drained and diminished, they departed Eicora, each seeking isolated slumber on worlds untouched by veins. The flame-bound gods remained, not as rulers, but as guardian gods charged with the same task Ashenvow had given to the Adrix upon their realization. They inherited a world both wounded and wondrous, a world forever marked by what it had endured. An age of gods and mortal ascendancy was coming, but not before an age of shadows loomed over the world for nearly half a century, in the aftermath of the sheer scale and tragedy of the Dragonfall Wars. The birth of the Pantheon and the slumber of dragons, Ascendance era through Shadow's era. They rose not to rule, but because the ones who ruled had fallen. The Eicora, verse 28. As the dust of the Dragonfall War settled, and the last echoes of divine battle faded into memory, the Flamebound stood where the Adrix had once soared. Mortals, once chosen as champions, now stood as gods, not by divine design, but by sheer endurance, sacrifice, and symbiosis with the Ashe. This marked the birth of the Pantheon, the beginning of a new age, where godhood was not inherited, it was earned. At the same time, the Adrix, shattered by loss and spent of their eternal essence, withdrew. Their departure was not one of abandonment, but of necessity. The dragons would sleep. Each flame-bound god came into their dominion with the blessing and burden of their former Adrix. They did not replace them, but reflected them. manifesting mortal aspects of elemental and existential truths. Temples were rededicated overnight. Names were rewritten in prayer. The people of Eicora, having witnessed these beings in battle, knew them not as myths, but as saviors. Meanwhile, the Adrix, though still whole, departed from the Wyrmheart's pulse. Kalos sank into the mantle of an unformed world. Balg Rhetoric vanished in a comet of molten flame. Ianrasil drifted into the root of a planet-sized tree in an unlit system. Their pact was kept, and so they slept. The gods now walked a narrow bridge, divine in power, mortal in origin. This made them more relatable and more fallible. Religion surged in their name. So too did skepticism. The Adrix, once unifying forces of balance, became myth, and the world they left behind no longer orbited around their eternal will. Instead, it turned to the will of the gods, born from its own blood. And, in the ruins of draconic sanctuaries across Osh, a few ancient sentinels remained. They had not forgotten their charge. They still guarded the Wyrmheart. The Ascension. Ascendance era through Shadows era. They were not made gods. They were honed into them. The Eicora, verse 29. The act of ascension was no rite, no blessing spoken in ritual. It was transfiguration through war. Each of the mortals chosen by the Adrix during the Dragonfall War underwent a metamorphosis, flesh and spirit reshaped by the elemental will of their patron. But it was not instantaneous. It was earned through pain, sacrifice, and devotion. The first signs of ascension were physical, skin laced with the veins of the Ashe, voices that could echo through dreams, breath that shimmered with divine resonance. In time, these mortals began to reflect their Adrix's domains, not only in power, but in purpose. Some bore the weight with humility, others struggled, still tethered to their humanity. But as the war demanded more of them, the last tethers burned away. Their mortal flaws became mythic lessons. Their choices became doctrine. They ascended not just in body, but in story. Their followers began to shape entire cultures around their philosophies. And by the war's end, these gods were no longer avatars. They were divinity incarnate. The Ascension forever changed the concept of godhood. No longer distant creators, gods were beings mortals could follow, question, and even remember as once being kin. It also fractured the structure of divine worship. Different sects rose not around the Adrix, but around how their chosen had evolved. Some revered their discipline. Others worshipped their flaws. Ascension, for all its glory, carried a cost. Each god remembered being mortal, and in those memories lay the seeds of every future conflict among them. The Adrix departure, Ascendance era through Shadows era. Even gods must rest when the stars burn through their bones. The Eicora, verse 30. The Adrix were not slain in war, nor sealed in exile. They simply left. Their departure was the final echo of the Dragonfall War, surrender not of pride but of purpose. With their power spent, their essence dimmed, and their threads of the Ashe woven into the new pantheon, the ancient dragons of creation withdrew from Eicora. Each departure marked the end of an epoch and the start of a world no longer guided by the breath of Ashenval's children. Some left quietly, others were seen, their passage written into the sky. A rain of feathers over the sylvan depths as Freylith vanished. A bolt of silence from the storm-racked peaks as Iafoa was gone. Few knew their destinations. Fewer still believed they'd ever return. Scholars debate whether the Adrix chose exile, sleep, or ascension to a new form. But one truth remains agreed upon. Their power was no longer present on Eicora. Rituals to reach them grew silent, their veins dimmed. In some places, they collapsed entirely. Only their legacy, reflected through the gods they left behind, remained. Their absence reshaped the spiritual landscape of the world. Cultures who had worshipped the Adrix for millennia mourned. Others adapted, turning instead to the new pantheon. Still others denied the departure, claiming the dragons only slumbered, waiting for Eicora's need to cry out again. But perhaps the greatest shift was felt in magic. With no Adrix to harmonize the elemental skeins, wild zones of raw, unstable Ashe formed across the planet. These wild fields birthed both miracles and monsters. The gods had ascended, and the dragons slept. The gods take the mantle, Shadow's era. Where they once walked beside the dragons, now they stood alone. The Eicora, verse 31. With the Adrix vanished into slumber and silence, the flame-bound gods stepped fully into their roles. No longer avatars, no longer mortals. They were divine now. And the mantle they assumed was not one of conquest, but of stewardship. Eicora was theirs to guide, protect, and shape. And in doing so, they became the very myths the next age would inherit. The transition was not instantaneous. Some gods hesitated, struggling with memory, identity, or the trauma of what they had endured. Others rose swiftly, forming new orders, crafting dogma, and establishing seats of divine power. Temples expanded, pilgrimages began. Cities named themselves after their patron deities. The gods did not rule from afar. They walked among their faithful, chose champions, and even occasionally intervened in mortal affairs. The Ashe responded to their touch. In some places, magic bloomed in harmony. In others, it buckled under the strain of unfamiliar divinity. Yet slowly balance returned. Not the balance of the Adrix, but of something new. The gods became central to every facet of life. Faith, law, war, healing, agriculture, and arcana. Their relationships with one another, alliances, rivalries, romances, shaped the histories of nations. Some questioned their right to reign. Others worshipped them without pause, but none denied their power. Their very breath reshaped the Ashe, and their will could shift the course of 1,000 lives. This was the age of divine rule. The world no longer waited for gods to descend from the stars. They were already here. The Watchers remain. Shadow's era. When the flame passes, the coals keep watch. The Eicora, verse 32. Though the Adrix had vanished into cosmic silence, and the gods walked anew upon the world, not all divine creations departed. In the strongholds of Osh, beneath obsidian stone and along the ancient ridges that ring the Wyrmheart's cradle, the Draconova remained. These mighty dragon-blooded sentinels, forged directly by the Adrix in ages past, had not been made for conquest or worship. They were made to protect. And even in the absence of their creators, they stood their vigil. Drakenstone, Serpent Spire, and Wormguard. These three bastions anchored the defense of Osh, encircling the vast lake where the Wyrmheart had been buried by Oceanvow himself. Within their vaults lay ancient relics, Adrix scripture, and war artifacts too dangerous to unleash again. The Draconova, each imbued with a spark of their progenitor's domain, continued to train, study, and prepare. They did not meddle in the affairs of kingdoms, nor participate in the Pantheon's disputes. They existed for one purpose: to guard the Wyrmheart from within and without. And as the world above changed, below they watched. Few mortals knew of the Draconova's continued presence. Their appearances were rare and often confused for myth. But the few who encountered them spoke of being so powerful, so old in spirit, they seemed to echo the voices of the Adrix themselves. Some believe they await the return of the dragons. Others fear that they are the last contingency should the Wyrmheart awaken. But one thing is certain: Eicora is not unguarded. The flame may have scattered, but the Watchers remain. The Rising of Kings. Shadow's era, through Era of Kings, through Worldbuilding era. Flame begets ash, ash begets earth, and from the earth, life will rise again. The Eicora, verse 40. In the wake of the Dragonfall War, and the celestial upheavals that came with it, the world knew the Age of Shadows. Demons imprisoned, a hollow driven back, the Adrix vanished beyond the stars. But what remained, what endured, was mortal life. From the ashes of divine war, the peoples of Eicora emerged not just bloodied, but awakened. The Shadows era, lasting but 47 years, was a time of reckoning. It was also a time of mourning, as the last traces of the Adrix vanished into myth and silence. But it was not the end. From this void, the millennials-long era of kings began. Civilizations arose across Eldrathia, Inali, and the central continent of Osh. Trade routes opened, guilds and cults, kingdoms and councils flourished. Gods took temples, mortals took thrones. Magic, once wild and divine, became art and practice. The flame-bound pantheon, born of the Adrix sacrifice, now took their place as stewards of the world. Where once they were avatars of war, now they were architects of peace, law, harvest, and lore. Their temples reached toward the stars their makers had fled. The current year is 3237 post-ascension. This is the newly transpired Worldbuilding era. so named for the strange arcane energies that pulse beneath the earth, slowly stirring anew. Eicora stands on the precipice of another turning. The Wyrmheart still sleeps, but the gods watch. The hollows stir, and somewhere beneath ash, frost, and stone, the flame waits.